A woman walked into a cafe for tea. By the time she left, she'd been humiliated for her beliefs, right in front of a crowd that said nothing. But the next day, her husband's Rolls-Royce pulled up. Karoline Leavitt wasn't the kind of woman who demanded the spotlight. She didn't walk into a room to be seen. She walked in to get something done, to help where she could, to leave things a little better than she found them. That's just who she was. Her neighbors in the small New Hampshire town of Exeter knew her as someone you could count on, reliable, respectful, always measured in her words, never one to pick a fight, but never afraid to stand firm in what she believed either. She had once held a title that brought her face onto television screens and political debates, but those days were behind her. Now, she poured her time into local causes, helping veterans find housing, working with food banks, mentoring high schoolgirls who needed a role model who wouldn't judge them, but also wouldn't let them give up. She believed in decency, in fairness, in the kind of old-fashioned dignity that says you treat people with respect, even when you disagree. It was a gray Saturday in early spring when Karoline decided to stop into a new cafe on Main Street. The town had been buzzing about it. Young couple from out of state, moved in, opened something modern with exposed brick, hand-poured lattes, and kombucha on tap. Not exactly her usual scene, but her friend Margie had said their chamomile tea was the best in town, and Karoline figured it was worth a visit before heading to the community center to review notes for an upcoming fundraiser. She parked her car, wrapped her scarf against the breeze, and stepped inside. The place was lively but not packed. College students tapping away at laptops, a few folks reading the paper, an older couple sharing a croissant. The air smelled of fresh coffee and warm pastries, and mellow indie music played just softly enough to make conversation possible. Karoline ordered her tea, offered a warm smile to the young woman behind the counter, and took a seat by the window, laying out her notes and glancing out occasionally at the passers-by on the street. It should have been an uneventful hour of peace, just one moment of stillness in a life full of service. But that's not how the world seems to work anymore. These days, it often feels like lines have been drawn so sharply that even kindness comes under suspicion. Somewhere between the first sip of tea and her second note card, a shift occurred. She noticed the young man behind the counter, tall, mid-20s, wearing a beanie and an apron with pins that carried bold political slogans, glancing at her again and again, each time with a little more sharpness. At first, she ignored it. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe he recognized her and didn't know from where. That happens sometimes. But then he leaned over to whisper something to the barista who'd served her, and both of them looked at Karoline with a blend of suspicion and thinly veiled disapproval. She tried to return to her notes, but the room's energy was changing. It was subtle, but real. People notice when they're being watched, and more than that, people know when they're not welcome. Karoline kept her posture straight, her expression calm, but her heart had already begun to ache with something she hadn't felt in years, the sting of being judged before a word had even been spoken. If you've ever lived long enough to be dismissed unfairly, not because of something you did, but because of what someone thinks you might believe, then you understand the quiet pain she felt building in that small moment. She didn't ask for a platform, didn't bring up politics, didn't wear a slogan on her shirt. All she did was walk into a cafe with the quiet hope of warmth and tea, and for that, someone had decided she didn't belong. My friend, if you believe that respect should never be conditional, if you believe that a person's right to be treated with dignity doesn't expire just because of their views or their past, then I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe. This channel isn't just about stories, it's about truth, about standing up when silence would be easier, and about reminding ourselves and each other that some values don't go out of style. If that resonates with you, I'd be honored to have you here. Because what happened next to Karoline wasn't loud or violent, but it was cruel. It was the kind of moment that stays with a person, not because it made headlines, but because it cuts right through to what we all want at the end of the day, to be treated like a human being. She had just lifted her teacup when the manager walked over and, with the entire room watching, told her in a cold, clear voice, "We don't serve your kind here." Karoline had barely been sitting 10 minutes when the shift in the room grew undeniable, like a low hum just beneath the surface that no one wanted to say out loud. She had just taken a sip of her tea when the young manager approached, mid-20s, sharp jawline, confidence bordering on arrogance, and a smirk that made it clear he had already judged her long before he ever learned her name. He stopped at her table, standing just close enough to show he had authority, but not enough to offer any kindness. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, voice clipped, eyes narrowing. "I recognize you. Aren't you that conservative woman who worked under the last administration?" Karoline blinked, taken aback. It wasn't the first time she had been recognized, but never like this, not with disdain draped over every word like poison. She nodded politely, unsure where he was going with it, hoping it was just a passing comment, something she could brush off with grace, but the words that followed stopped her cold. "We have a policy here of creating a safe and inclusive space," he continued, his tone rehearsed, almost performative. "Your views don't align with our values. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." At first, she thought she had misheard. The words hit her with the surreal weight of a bad dream, the kind where everyone in the room suddenly sees you as something other, something dangerous, without you ever opening your mouth. She stared at him, stunned. "Excuse me?" she said softly, hoping for clarity, for a chance to steady what had just begun to spiral. But he didn't flinch, didn't blink. He doubled down, repeating himself, louder now, so the nearby tables could hear it too, and they did. Heads turned, conversations paused, forks stopped midway to mouths. She looked around and saw the stares, not curious, not kind, but cold and calculating, as though they were waiting for her to argue, to make a scene, to prove them right. Some of them whispered. She saw one young man snicker to his friend, both of them watching her like spectators at a show they had paid for. Karoline could feel the heat rising in her chest, not from anger, not yet, but from disbelief. Was she really being asked to leave, not for what she said or did, but simply for who she had once worked for a job that, regardless of where people stood politically, had been about service, about sacrifice, about representing a voice? She had come in for tea and ended up on trial, sentenced and dismissed in front of strangers. Her instinct was to stay still, to ground herself in that wooden chair and demand to be treated like a human being. But something inside her told her not to give them the satisfaction of a spectacle, not to let them strip her of the one thing she still held on to, her composure. So she calmly began gathering her papers, sliding them neatly into her folder, tucking her pen into her purse. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the injustice of it all. Her heart pounded as if it was trying to make sense of what her mind couldn't. "Thank you," she said quietly, not because she meant it, but because she refused to leave without grace. As she stood and walked toward the door, she could feel the silence behind her. It wasn't just silence, it was heavy, like a weight pressing down on the back of her shoulders. The kind of silence that tells you you're no longer welcome. The kind that lets you know people aren't just judging you, they're enjoying it. She walked slowly, with dignity, her head high, not giving them the drama they clearly craved. But, inside, something deep within her cracked. Not because she was embarrassed. Karoline had weathered public scrutiny before, but because something about this moment felt like a line had been crossed. She wasn't a politician anymore. She wasn't making policy. She wasn't standing behind a podium. She was just a woman in a cafe, and even that, apparently, was enough to be cast out. Outside, the sky had dimmed slightly, clouds rolling, and as if to echo the mood she carried in her chest. She reached her car, sat behind the wheel, and for a long moment, just breathed. The tears didn't come. Not yet. But the questions did. When did we become a nation where a person can be banished from a public place because of their beliefs? When did dignity stop mattering? When did civility become conditional? She didn't have the answers. All she had was the ache of humiliation, the bitter taste of rejection still lingering. And as she sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, she realized something else. She wasn't angry just for herself. She was angry for every man and woman who had ever been quietly told they no longer belonged. For every veteran ignored in a job interview because their values didn't align. For every older worker dismissed because they weren't progressive enough. For every person who still believed in respect, in decency, in earning your place with quiet effort, not loud ideology. Karoline had been judged by people who didn't know her, hadn't lived what she lived, hadn't served the way she had served. But they felt entitled to shame her anyway, because now, shame had become a public sport, and what scared her most was not that it happened, but how easy it had become. The cafe wasn't just a place that served coffee anymore. It was a symbol of a deeper fracture, a world where justice meant just us, and where safe spaces were only safe for people who already agreed. Karoline drove home in silence, her tea untouched, her papers untouched, her heart bruised but her spine unbroken. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, this quiet, cruel dismissal, was about to become something far bigger than a bad afternoon. Because by the time the next day arrived, and her husband's silver Rolls-Royce rolled up in front of that cafe, the entire town would be watching, and this time, no one would be looking away. By Sunday morning, the peaceful New Hampshire town that Karoline had always called home felt strangely unfamiliar, like a place tilted just slightly off axis. The incident at the cafe had taken on a life of its own, spreading through social media and local news faster than anyone could have predicted. A video had surfaced, shaky phone footage from another customer, capturing the exact moment the young manager asked her to leave. It showed Karoline sitting calmly, her hands folded, her voice quiet, dignified, but the humiliation was unmistakable, and the way it was framed, zoomed in, lingered on her silent departure, made her look like the villain to some, and a martyr to others. The local blogger who posted it titled the clip, "Conservative Woman. Denied service, was it justified?" The comment section exploded within hours. On one side were people who applauded the manager, claiming he was brave for upholding his inclusive values, as though forcing someone out for her political past was some kind of moral victory. Others were outraged, calling it a disgrace, a betrayal of basic decency. But what hit Karoline the hardest weren't the strangers. It was the silence from people she knew. People she had volunteered beside, helped raise money with, supported when their kids were sick or their parents passed away. People she had considered friends. They didn't text, they didn't call, they didn't show up. It was like she'd been marked. As if her quiet exit from that cafe had cast a shadow long enough to dim her presence across town. At the grocery store, people glanced at her and quickly looked away. At church, a woman she'd sat beside every Sunday for 3 years didn't even acknowledge her with a nod. Karoline wasn't someone who needed the spotlight, but now the absence of acknowledgement felt louder than any insult. She didn't cry. Not yet. But the weight of isolation pressed hard against her chest. When she returned home each day, it was to a house that felt just a little colder, not because the thermostat had changed, but because the world outside had. And inside that house, even her own sense of self began to flicker. She'd done everything right. She had served, worked hard, stayed respectful. She had never thrown her beliefs in anyone's face, never belittled those who thought differently. But now, none of that mattered. Because once you were labeled, once the narrative took hold, it didn't matter what you'd actually said or done. People didn't need to know you to judge you. They just needed a hashtag and a headline. One evening, while sorting through boxes for the charity drive, she found an old letter from a veteran's widow she'd helped secure benefits for, back when she worked in D.C. The words were filled with gratitude, but what caught her was the last line. "Don't let the noise of others drown out your purpose." She sat there holding that letter, blinking away the sting in her eyes. That purpose, that sense of quiet mission, had always been her compass. But now, it felt buried beneath a wave of anger and misunderstanding. What stung even more was how, quickly, the story morphed. Local news outlets started spinning their own versions. "Right-wing agitator disrupts cafe's peaceful vibe," one headline read. Agitator? She hadn't said a word beyond "thank you." But facts no longer mattered. Perception did, and perception was being weaponized. Her inbox began to fill, not with support, but with veiled threats, anonymous messages telling her to stay gone, know her place, or even move out of town. The kind of messages that weren't direct enough to report, but unsettling enough to shake you when you're locking the doors at night. Her husband, Andrew, noticed the change too. A normally reserved man, proud but private, he started to ask more questions each evening. Did anyone say anything today? Did anyone bother you? She would smile and say no, trying to protect him from the truth. But one night, she left her phone on the kitchen counter, and he saw one of the messages. She came back to find him staring at it, jaw clenched. He didn't say much, just set the phone down, walked into his study, and closed the door. That next morning, without a word, he pulled the silver Rolls-Royce out of the garage, a car they almost never drove, too flashy for their daily lives, and left the house dressed in his best tailored suit. He was a man who believed in quiet strength, who had built his life on honor, not noise. Karoline watched from the porch, puzzled, her heart thudding in her chest as she watched him drive away. She didn't know where he was going, but she knew that look on his face. It was the same one he'd had when they lost their first child and the doctor wouldn't speak plainly. It was the look of a man who had just decided he would no longer allow the world to mistreat what he loved. Meanwhile, online, things only got worse. A local activist group called for the cafe to be celebrated for its actions. They posted screenshots of Karoline's past political affiliations, dissecting her every vote, every speech, every sentence she'd ever spoken into a microphone, painting her not just as a person with different beliefs, but as a threat. This is what accountability looks like, one post read. Accountability for what? For sitting in a cafe and ordering tea? For doing her job years ago, for an administration she no longer worked under. The deeper she looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't about her personally. It was about control, about making examples out of people who didn't fall in line. And the worst part? It was working. Businesses began pulling out of her charity event, saying they didn't want to be associated with controversy. A community center she helped raise funds for suddenly stopped returning her calls. And the local library, where she volunteered, twice a week helping veterans apply for benefits, asked if she could take some time off until things cooled down. That was the moment it all cracked. Not the video, not the whispers, not even the headlines. It was that quiet, bureaucratic sentence, take some time off, spoken without malice but loaded with cowardice. She had given her time, her heart, her energy to these places, and now they couldn't even look her in the eye. They were done with her. Done without a thank you, without a question, without a chance to explain. Karoline sat alone on her back porch that night, her fingers wrapped tightly around a lukewarm mug of tea, the stars above her distant and indifferent. In the background, the hum of her neighborhood, once warm, familiar, now felt like a stranger's song. And in that stillness, a thought passed through her mind so fast, so raw, it left her breathless. Maybe I don't belong here anymore. The sky over Main Street was a cool gray, like the calm before a storm or the quiet just after one, and Karoline stood at her bedroom window for a moment, staring down at the street that had felt both so familiar and so foreign in recent days. The morning had passed slowly, every hour tugging on her with uncertainty, but when the clock neared 2 in the afternoon, she heard the unmistakable sound of the garage door lifting, followed by the deep, even purr of the silver Rolls-Royce engine. She knew what that meant. Andrew had made up his mind. She turned, picked up her coat, and walked downstairs without a word, meeting him at the front door. He didn't ask if she was ready. He didn't need to. The unspoken understanding between them had grown deeper through the silence of the last few nights. When he opened the passenger door for her, his eyes met hers with a steady calm that said everything. We're doing this together. As they drove toward the cafe, the streets seemed more aware somehow. People turned to watch as the car passed, some out of curiosity, others out of recognition. The Rolls-Royce wasn't loud, but it wasn't invisible either. It carried weight not because of its price tag, but because of what it represented: discipline, sacrifice, and a lifetime of unspoken integrity. When they reached the cafe, Andrew parked not in front to make a scene, but across the street, just far enough to show they hadn't come to flaunt anything, but close enough that no one could ignore the arrival. Karoline stepped out first, dressed simply, the same as always. No makeup, no jewelry, no designer coat. Just her, with her shoulders squared and her eyes forward. Andrew followed, opening the cafe door with quiet grace, holding it open for her. The bell above the door rang out like a challenge, crisp and sharp. Conversations paused, heads turned. The same trendy art still hung on the walls, the same indie music still floated through the speakers, but the atmosphere was different now, tense, unsure. They didn't rush. They walked to the same table by the window she'd been forced to leave days ago and sat. Karoline placed her purse down gently and looked out the window for a moment, collecting herself. Then she looked up, and there he was, the manager, younger than her by decades but older now in his expression, the smugness drained away and replaced by something like discomfort. He walked toward them slowly, clearly unsure how this was going to go. The last 48 hours hadn't gone the way he'd expected. Online, the backlash against his actions had picked up unexpected steam. News outlets picked up the story, not just local ones, but regional papers and radio shows too. Veterans had started speaking up. Women in the community, some liberal, some conservative, had begun posting that no woman, no neighbor, should be treated the way Karoline had been. A few prominent donors to local organizations had even hinted that their support would dry up if this was the tone Main Street was taking. The cafe's Yelp and Google pages were flooded with one-star reviews, and not from bots, from real people who had watched the video and seen something deeply wrong in it. The manager approached the table with hesitancy. His hands were clasped, awkwardly in front of him, and for a second it looked like he might try to apologize. But before he could open his mouth, Karoline raised her eyes and met his gaze with a calm so centered it made him freeze. "We'll be having 2 teas to go, please," she said, her voice quiet but firm. There was no edge, no sarcasm, just grace, and the power of a woman who had chosen not to return to start a fight, but to reclaim something that had been taken from her without cause, her dignity. The manager nodded, clearly caught off guard by the absence of confrontation. He turned and shuffled back toward the counter. Around the room, the silence deepened, but not in a hostile way. People were watching, closely now. Some leaned toward each other, whispering. Others, sensing the weight of the moment, simply sat still, taking it in. A woman in her 60s, sitting near the door with a paperback in hand, clapped once, then again. Then others followed, soft, scattered claps that swelled into a short, gentle round of applause. Karoline didn't react to the noise, but her eyes welled with quiet recognition. It wasn't about the tea. It never had been. It was about making a stand in a way that didn't require shouting, lawsuits, or viral retaliation. It was about saying, "I still belong here." When the teas were handed to them, white cups with cardboard sleeves, nothing fancy, Karoline took hers and stood slowly. Andrew did too. They didn't say another word. No speeches, no stares. Just a simple walk to the door. But this time, when she crossed the threshold, the room didn't turn cold. It turned warm. And that warmth followed them across the street, all the way back to the car. As they pulled away, Karoline glanced at the rearview mirror, not at the cafe, but at her own reflection. There was strength there. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that bends without breaking, the kind that rises quietly, no matter how many times the world tries to knock it down. That evening, her phone rang for the first time in days, not with more messages of hate, but from a local business owner who had seen the moment and wanted her to speak at an upcoming event about resilience and leadership. Then another call came from a parent-teacher group that wanted her to help moderate a discussion on civil discourse. Slowly, the tide had begun to turn, not because she lashed out, but because she had refused to fold. And as Karoline sat at the kitchen table sipping the last of that tea, her fingers warm against the paper cup, Andrew sat across from her saying only one thing. "You didn't just walk back in there today. You walked through everything they tried to bury you under, and came out cleaner than they ever expected. The truth was, something big was coming next. Not because Karoline planned it, but because the town now saw her not as a symbol of division, but as a reminder of what dignity really looks like under fire. That silver Rolls-Royce never had to roar through town to make a statement. It simply glided, steady and certain, a quiet symbol of a life earned, not given, of years filled with sacrifice, late nights, quiet patience, and holding the line when it would have been easier to fold. And that day, as it rolled away from the cafe and back through the same streets that had watched Karoline walk out in silence just days before, something had shifted, not just in the town, but in the hearts of those who had watched it all unfold. It wasn't about the car, the politics, or even the cafe anymore. It was about a woman who stood in the middle of a storm with her back straight and her chin high, who answered humiliation not with rage but with resolve, who showed that strength doesn't always look like a raised voice. It can also be a quiet walk back into the same place that tried to humiliate you, holding your head just a little higher than before. Word spread quickly after that second visit. Not through gossip, not through social media algorithms, but through real conversations, on porches, in grocery store aisles, at barber shops and diner counters where folks still remembered what dignity looked like, even if the world seemed to forget. Some people were surprised by how deeply it hit them. A retired veteran from the North Side stopped her on the street just 2 days later. He didn't say much, just tipped his cap and said, "You did right by yourself. That's what matters." Another woman, a lifelong Democrat who disagreed with Karoline's politics but had seen the video, sent her a handwritten note that said, "We don't have to agree, but no one deserves to be treated that way. Thank you for standing with grace." It wasn't about political sides anymore. Something deeper had cracked open, something older than campaign slogans or partisan rants. The cafe's online reviews continued to suffer, not from trolls, but from locals who simply voiced what they felt. That exclusion, no matter how dressed up in progressive language, was still exclusion. But Karoline didn't celebrate the cafe's decline. That wasn't what she'd wanted. Her victory wasn't in their loss. It was in her reclaiming of a space she had every right to occupy. She didn't go on talk shows or national news. She stayed in New Hampshire, walking the same streets, volunteering at the same food bank, speaking quietly to those who asked, not about revenge or retribution, but about what it means to live with principle. So when the town hall asked her to speak 2 weeks later, not as a political figure but as a neighbor, she didn't hesitate. The auditorium was full, not of activists or protesters, but of townspeople, husbands, wives, grandfathers, teachers, people who'd seen too many friendships ruined over politics, people who were tired of feeling like they had to walk on eggshells just to be heard. When Karoline took the stage, she didn't use a teleprompter or prepared remarks. She spoke plainly, like she always had. "I'm not here to talk about right or left," she said. "I'm here to talk about right and wrong. We don't have to think alike, but we have to live together. Disagreement isn't disrespect. But when we start silencing each other, just because someone thinks differently, that's not protecting community. That's tearing it apart." And the room was silent, not because they disagreed, but because they were listening. Really listening. And when she finished, they stood, not because it was expected, but because something in what she said hit a truth that had gone too long unspoken. In the days that followed, a ripple began moving through the town. Churches started hosting civil conversation nights. The local high school held a forum on respectful debate. More and more people, on both sides of the aisle, began stepping up to say we can do better. We have to do better. Karoline didn't change the world, but she did remind one corner of it what it meant to stand tall when the world tells you to sit down. Not with fury, not with noise, but with quiet strength that doesn't need applause to be real. Her legacy wasn't in headlines or hashtags. It was in a new kind of conversation that started showing up, in small moments, in honest talks, in a little more patience between neighbors. In a world obsessed with volume, Karoline showed the power of restraint. In a culture drowning in conflict, she offered the rare clarity of conviction. And in doing so, she reminded every man watching, especially the ones who had built their lives on sweat, grit, and self-respect, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't to fight louder. It's to walk back in, look the world in the eye, and refuse to be erased. True strength isn't about fighting with noise or anger. It's about standing with unwavering dignity and respect, even when the odds are against you. If you believe in justice, honor, and the power of quiet courage, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that matters. Your support helps keep these important conversations alive.